She could hear them breathing. Not all 600 of them, of course, but enough to know that the men gathered in the clearing beyond the tree line were real, that they were armed, and that they had no idea she was watching. Sergeant Ellery Garrett lay flat against the forest floor, her cheek pressed into a bed of pine needles that smelled like cold earth and turpentine. The dampness seeped through her uniform and settled against her skin, but she did not move. She had not moved in 47 minutes. Her eyes were open, fixed on the narrow gap between two fallen logs where the forest gave way to a wide clearing in the old timber plantation. Through that gap, she could see movement, shapes passing between tree trunks, the orange glow of cooking fires barely visible in the pre-dawn gray. The sound of voices carried through still morning air, casual and unhurried. Men talking the way men talk when they believe no one is listening. 150 meters away, close enough to hear laughter, close enough to smell wood smoke and coffee, close enough that if any one of those 600 men looked in exactly the right direction, with exactly the right focus, they might see the outline of a woman's face in the undergrowth. But they would not look. That was the whole point. 6 people. 600 people. The math was simple and the math was impossible, and none of that mattered right now, because right now the only thing that mattered was stillness. Ellery breathed through her nose, shallow and slow, the way Marcus had taught her 3 years ago in the training forests of northern Washington. Control the breath and you control the body. Control the body and you control the fear. Control the fear and you become invisible. She could feel her heart beating against the ground beneath her, steady and strong, and she let it beat without trying to slow it down, because that was another thing Marcus had taught her. Your heart knows what it is doing. Trust it. Save your discipline for the things you can actually control. Behind her, spaced at careful intervals, 5 men lay equally still. 5 men who had followed her into this forest 14 days ago, and who were now lying in the dirt 150 meters from a small army trusting her with their lives. She had not earned that trust yet, not fully. She knew it and they knew it, and the forest knew it. That was about to change. But that part of the story comes later. First, you need to understand how 6 people ended up in the dirt on a mountainside in Montana, outgunned 100 to 1, with nothing between them and annihilation, except silence and patience, and a radio that could call down fire from the sky. 14 days earlier, the world had been different. The briefing room at Camp Fielding smelled like burnt coffee and whiteboard markers. It was a temporary structure, half tent and half plywood, set up on the edge of a National Guard staging area in the Flathead Valley. Outside, the July heat pushed temperatures into the high 90s, and the humidity coming off the river made the air feel thick enough to chew. Inside, a single air conditioning unit fought a losing battle against the body heat of 30 people crammed into a space built for 15. Ellery stood near the back wall, arms crossed, studying the topographic map that covered most of the front display board. She had been studying in that map for 3 days already, memorizing the contour lines, the drainage patterns, the ridge lines and saddles that define the terrain east of Camp Fielding. The Pine Ridge Wilderness. 70,000 acres of old-growth forest, steep ravines, and mountain meadows that stretch from the valley floor up to the Continental Divide. Beautiful country, dangerous country, and right now, country that belonged to someone else. The sovereign wolves had moved into the Pine Ridge 6 months ago. What started as a handful of armed men camping on federal land had grown into something much larger and much more frightening. 600 armed fighters organized into companies and platoons led by a man named Colonel Elias Hargrove, a former military officer who had decided that the federal government no longer had authority over the Mountain West. They had weapons. They had fortified positions. They had supply lines running through 3 counties. And according to the intelligence briefing that Ellery had read twice that morning, they were planning something big. An attack, possibly on the town of Ridgecrest, a small federal administrative center 12 miles west of Pine Ridge, home to 300 civilians, a post office, a Forest Service district office, and a federal courthouse. The intelligence said the wolves intended to seize Ridgecrest, hold it, and use it as a declaration of sovereignty, a statement that the old rules no longer applied. The timeline was unclear. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe sooner. The intelligence was incomplete, built from satellite imagery, intercepted radio traffic, and the accounts of 2 hikers who had stumbled into a wolf patrol and been held for 3 days before being released with a warning. Colonel Brian Kessler stood at the front of the room, pointer in hand, moving it across the map with the confident strokes of a man who believed that problems were things you solved with sufficient force. Kessler was 55 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a voice that carried the flat authority of a career spent giving orders and having them obeyed. He wore his National Guard uniform with the precision of someone who cared about creases and alignment. His plan was simple, and he explained it simply. 200 National Guard soldiers, 12 helicopters, an air assault into the Pine Ridge to locate and engage the sovereign wolves. Fast, aggressive, overwhelming. Find them, fix them, finish them. Kessler tapped the map 3 times for emphasis, each tap landing on a different valley where satellite imagery had detected possible encampments. Ellery watched him talk and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, something worse. Recognition. She had seen this kind of confidence before. She had seen it in the faces of men who believed that speed and numbers could solve any problem, and she had seen what happened when the force proved them wrong. She looked across the room and found Marcus Driscoll sitting in a folding chair near the sidewall. He was 62 years old, and he looked every day of it, his hair gone silver, deep lines carved into a face that had spent decades in wind and sun and cold. His left knee was wrapped in a brace that he pretended didn't bother him, and he held a paper cup of coffee that he hadn't touched. Marcus had been the best tactical reconnaissance commander in the unit's history. He had operated in forests on 3 continents. He had written training manuals that were still in use. And now he was here as a consultant because his knee wouldn't let him walk more than a mile without swelling to the size of a cantaloupe, and that fact was slowly killing him in a way that was worse than any enemy ever could. 7 years ago, Marcus had led a 12-man team into the Cascade Range to locate a fortified compound used by an armed separatist group. The intelligence had been good. The terrain had been mapped. Everything was in order. But the team leader of the forward element, a young sergeant named Pollard, had grown impatient on the 3rd day. Pollard had decided that the cautious approach was taking too long. He pushed his 4-man element ahead of the main body, moving fast, covering ground, trying to make contact before nightfall. He found contact, a concealed fighting position that he walked past without seeing. 3 of his 4 men were killed in the first 8 seconds of the ambush. Pollard survived, but lost his right arm below the elbow and never returned to the field. Marcus had been 800 meters behind when the shooting started. He heard the gunfire through the trees, that distinctive popping sound that is nothing like the movies make it, and he knew immediately what had happened. He knew because he had warned Pollard that morning. He had said the words that he would later teach Ellery, the words that became the foundation of everything he believed about operating in the forest. Patience is not the absence of action. It is the most disciplined form of action there is. Pollard had not listened. 3 men had died. And Marcus had carried that weight in his chest for 7 years, a stone that never got lighter, that shifted positions sometimes but never left. It was that weight more than anything else that had made him the teacher he became. Because the best teachers are not the ones who succeeded effortlessly. The best teachers are the ones who watched someone fail and swore that it would never happen again on their watch. When he found Ellery 3 years later, a 26-year-old newly promoted sergeant, with an unusual stillness about her and eyes that watched more than they spoke, he recognized something. Not talent exactly, though she had that. Something rarer. The willingness to be slow when everything inside her wanted to be fast. The understanding that the forest did not care about schedules or ambition or the need to prove yourself. The forest cared about one thing only, whether you saw the danger before the danger saw you. Marcus caught Ellery's eye and gave a small nod. Not encouragement exactly. Acknowledgement. a signal that said what he had said to her 100 times in training. Watch, listen, think, then speak. Kessler finished his briefing and asked for questions. A few officers raised procedural points, logistics concerns, helicopter availability, rules of engagement. Nobody questioned the fundamental approach. Nobody asked whether flying 12 helicopters into a mountain wilderness might give the sovereign wolves enough warning to scatter into the timber like smoke. Nobody except Ellery. She didn't raise her hand. She just spoke, her voice cutting through the room's murmur with a clarity that came from years of learning to be heard without shouting. There was another option, she said. 30 heads turned. Kessler looked at her with the expression of a man who has just discovered an insect in his soup. He knew who she was. Everyone in the room knew who she was. Sergeant Ellery Garrett, 29 years old, leader of a 6-person Federal Tactical Response Unit scout team, the youngest patrol commander in the division. A woman in a room full of men, which in this particular world still meant something, no matter how many policy memos said otherwise. Kessler asked her what option she had in mind. Ellery walked to the map. She pointed to the Pine Ridge, to the valleys and ridge lines east of Camp Fielding. She explained her proposal in short, precise sentences. A 6-person patrol, light, quiet, invisible. They would move into the Pine Ridge on foot, no helicopters, no vehicles, no noise. They would find the sovereign wolves, determine their exact position, their strength, their preparations. And then instead of engaging with direct fire, they would call in artillery from Camp Fielding's battery of 105mm howitzers, which could reach any point in the operational area. Find them, fix their position, call the fire, destroy them without ever being seen. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kessler smiled the way a patient teacher smiles at a student who has just said something foolish. 6 people, he said, against 600. Yes, sir. In 70,000 acres of forest. Yes, sir. And you want me to wait while 6 people walk around the woods for 2 weeks instead of sending in a force that can actually get the job done? Kessler did not wait for an answer. He turned back to the room and continued his briefing. The matter settled in his mind. Ellery stood by the map for a moment longer, then returned to her position against the back wall. Her face showed nothing, but her jaw was set in a way that Marcus recognized from 3 years of working with her, a hardness that looked like stubbornness, but was actually something closer to certainty. After the briefing, Marcus caught up with her outside the tent. The heat hit them like opening an oven door. Insects hummed in the tall grass along the gravel path. Somewhere on the staging area, a helicopter engine whined up to speed and then settled back to idle. Marcus told her he would talk to the task force commander. Not Kessler, the man above Kessler. He would ask for 48 hours, 2 weeks of reconnaissance before the air assault launched. If Ellery's team found nothing, Kessler could have his helicopters. But if they found the target, if they could fix the wolves' position precisely enough for effective artillery fire, then the math changed. Then 6 people with a radio could do what 200 soldiers with helicopters might not. Ellery looked at him. She wanted to say thank you, but Marcus had taught her that gratitude was for after the mission, not before. So instead, she asked him one question. What if I am wrong? Marcus took a sip of his cold coffee and grimaced at the taste. Then you will be wrong in the woods, which is the best place to be wrong, because the trees do not write performance reviews. He paused. But you are not wrong, Ellery. I have watched you for 3 years. You read terrain like other people read newspapers. You understand patience in a way that most soldiers never will. The only question is whether you trust yourself as much as I trust you. She did not answer. She did not need to. 2 days later, the team assembled at the eastern edge of Camp Fielding in the gray light before dawn. 6 people and their equipment lined up along a dirt track that led into the tree line 300 meters away. The forest stood like a wall, dark and dense, the first row of pines casting long shadows in the early light. Ellery checked her team one final time. Each of them carried enough gear to survive 2 weeks in the wilderness without resupply. Rifles, either the heavier SLR or the lighter M16, depending on preference. Claymore mines strapped flat against their packs, spare magazines in every available pocket, grenades hanging from load-bearing vests, water purification tablets. Emergency rations, first aid kits, signal mirrors, and the most important item of all, the PRC-77 radio that Beckett Lyle carried on his back, like a child carries a beloved stuffed animal. Always close, always protected. That radio was their lifeline, their weapon, their connection to the artillery battery that could reach out and destroy anything within a 10-kilometer radius. Without it, they were 6 people with small arms. With it, they were a forward observer unit capable of directing the kind of firepower that could reshape a mountainside. Nolan Pruitt stood at the front of the formation, already scanning the tree line with eyes that never seemed to rest. 32 years old, born and raised in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming, Nolan had been hunting elk and mule deer since he was old enough to carry a rifle. He had tracked animals through terrain that would have defeated most people with GPS units and satellite phones. In the unit, he was the point man, the first one into any environment, the one whose job was to see what others missed. A bent blade of grass, a scuff mark on a rock, a spider web broken at the wrong height. These were the things Nolan saw when other people saw only forest. Beckett Lyle, the radio operator, was 38 and built like a man designed specifically for carrying heavy things through difficult terrain. Broad-shouldered, thick through the chest, with hands that could thread a radio antenna through a needle-sized port or field strip a weapon in the dark. Beckett never raised his voice. He had a way of speaking into the radio that made even urgent transmissions sound like casual conversation, which was exactly the tone you wanted when you were whispering coordinates while the enemy slept 100 meters away. Cormac Whitaker, 34, was the explosive specialist. He carried the claymore mines and understood detonation the way a musician understands rhythm. He could set a claymore in the dark by feel alone positioning the curved face toward the kill zone and running the wire back to the firing device without making a sound louder than a leaf settling on water. Cormac was from rural Vermont, the son of a quarry blaster, and he had grown up understanding that controlled destruction was an art form. And then there was Shepard Vane. Shepard was 27 years old, the youngest member of the team, and this was his first major operational deployment. He had graduated at the top of his training class. He had excelled in every evaluation and exercise. On paper, he was exceptional, but paper does not sweat. Paper does not lie in the dirt for 8 hours listening to its own heartbeat and wondering if the next sound it hears will be the click of a safety being disengaged. Shepard had never done this for real, and everyone on the team knew it, including Shepard. He stood at the back of the formation with his jaw set and his eyes forward, trying to project a confidence he did not entirely feel. Ellery had watched him during the preparation phase and had seen the small tells. The way he checked his weapon one extra time, the way he adjusted his pack straps repeatedly, looking for a comfort that had nothing to do with weight distribution. He was nervous, and being nervous was fine. What mattered was what he did with the nerves. Ellery stood in front of her team and did not give a speech. Speeches were for people who needed motivation, and these 5 did not need motivation. They needed information, and they needed trust. She told them the mission parameters: 14 days maximum, movement rate of no more than 200 meters per hour, total noise discipline at all times, which meant no talking above a whisper, no metal-on-metal contact, no careless footfalls. Every 30 minutes, Beckett would transmit their grid coordinates back to camp fielding. They would move during daylight when they could see tripwires and sentries, and they would establish hidden observation posts at night. The objective was simple: find the sovereign wolves, determine their exact position, their numbers, their armaments, their preparations, report back. And if the opportunity presented itself, call in artillery and destroy them. She told them one more thing, something Marcus had told her years ago, and that she had carried with her like a stone in her pocket ever since. In the forest, the side that sees first has already won. Our job is to see first. Everything else follows from that. Nobody responded. Nobody needed to. Ellery turned toward the tree line and began walking. Behind her, 5 men followed in single file, spaced 5 meters apart, each one stepping where the person ahead had stepped, leaving a trail so faint that within an hour the forest would erase it entirely. They crossed the dirt track. They reached the first row of pines. And then the forest swallowed them whole the way it had swallowed so many others silently and completely, as if they had never existed at all. The first 12 days were a study in patience so extreme it bordered on meditation. They moved through the Pine Ridge wilderness, the way water moves through limestone slowly and along the path of least resistance. Ellery navigated by terrain association, matching the contour lines on her map to the ridges and valleys around her, adjusting their route to stay below the skyline and out of open meadows where a distant observer with binoculars might spot movement. The forest itself was a cathedral of old-growth ponderosa pine Douglas fir and western larch. Trees that had been growing for 300 years rose 150 feet into the air, their canopies so dense that at midday the forest floor existed in a perpetual twilight. The understory was thick with huckleberry bushes, bare grass, and the skeletal remains of fallen timber that had been decomposing for decades. The ground was soft with accumulated needles, which was good for silent movement, but treacherous on slopes where the damp layer could slide under your boots like a carpet on a polished floor. The heat was brutal. 95 degrees by noon, with humidity from the river valleys turning the air into something you wore rather than breathed. Sweat soaked through their uniforms within the first hour of each day and never dried. The smell of their own bodies mixed with pine resin and the dark, rich scent of decomposing wood until it became a single constant presence that they stopped noticing by the third day. They developed routines that were invisible to anyone watching from the outside, but that held the team together like the joints in a stone wall. Every morning before first light, Ellery would check each team member with a series of hand signals, a visual inventory that confirmed everyone was alert, hydrated, and ready to move. Nolan would spend the first 30 minutes of daylight reading the ground around their overnight position, looking for any sign that their presence had been detected, any fresh track that didn't belong to them, any disturbance that might mean someone had passed nearby in the dark. Cormac took responsibility for the claymores, positioning them each evening along the most likely avenues of approach to their sleeping position, then retrieving them each morning with the careful choreography of a man who understood that the devices he handled were indifferent to the intentions of whoever triggered them. Beckett maintained the radio with the obsessive attention of a surgeon maintaining a heart-lung machine, checking the battery levels every 4 hours, testing the frequency in brief encrypted bursts that lasted less than a second, keeping the handset wrapped in a waterproof bag that he had modified himself with a quick-release tab that could be opened silently with one hand. These routines were not just practical, they were psychological. In the absence of progress, in the silence and the heat and the endless green sameness of the forest, routine was the thing that kept the mind from turning inward, from starting the slow spiral of doubt that could unravel a team faster than any enemy contact. They saw no one. For 12 days they found nothing. No camps, no patrols, no supply caches. Just forest, endless and indifferent, stretching out in every direction like a green ocean with no shore. Shepard Vane felt the frustration first and felt it worst. On the 8th day during a rest halt, he leaned close to Ellery and whispered what everyone else was thinking. "We have covered 6 kilometers in 8 days. We could have walked this in an afternoon. Are we sure they are even out here?" Ellery looked at him. She understood the frustration. She felt it too, in the way that a fisherman feels frustration on a day when nothing bites. But the fisherman does not leave the water because the fish do not care about the fisherman's schedule. She whispered back, her lips barely moving. "The forest talks to you if you are quiet enough to listen. We have not been quiet enough yet." Shepard did not reply, but his doubt was visible, and doubt in the field is contagious. Ellery saw Cormac glance at Shepard and then glance at her, measuring, weighing, making the calculations that soldiers always make about their leaders. She filed it away and kept moving. On the 10th day, Nolan found a footprint, a single boot print in the mud beside a creek crossing, partially washed away by water, but still readable. Military surplus tread pattern, size 11 or 12, recent, maybe 2 days old. Nolan knelt beside it for a full minute reading the print the way a scholar reads an ancient text, extracting meaning from depth and angle and the pattern of displacement around the edges. Ellery knelt beside him, and they communicated in hand signals. One person, moving northeast, standard pace not hurried, probably a scout or a runner carrying messages between positions. It was not much, one footprint, one person, but it was the first physical evidence that the sovereign wolves were using this part of the forest, and it meant the team was moving in the right direction. Ellery adjusted their route slightly northeast, and they continued. On the 12th day, nothing. On the 13th day, everything. The afternoon light was turning golden, the sun dropping toward the ridgeline to the west, sending long columns of light through gaps in the canopy. The forest was at its most beautiful and its most deceptive at this hour, because the shifting light created shadows that moved even when nothing else did, and a careless eye could mistake a shadow for a man or a man for a shadow. Nolan was on point 10 meters ahead of the rest of the team, moving through a stand of young pine that had grown up in the gap left by a long-dead giant. He was placing each foot with the deliberate precision of a man walking across a floor made of glass, testing the ground with his toe before committing his weight, his rifle held across his chest with his finger indexed along the receiver above the trigger. Then he stopped. His left fist came up and closed the universal signal. Freeze. Behind him, 5 people became statues. Mid-step, mid-breath, wherever they were when the signal came, they stopped and held. Nolan sank slowly to one knee. His eyes were fixed on the ground ahead of him. Ellery waited 10 seconds. 20. 30. Then she moved forward in a crouch. Each step placed on ground she could see was clear until she was beside Nolan. She looked down at what had stopped him. Footprints. Not one, dozens. Overlapping, crossing back and forth across a narrow game trail that cut through the pine stand. Boot prints, military surplus, the deep lug tread worn by men who spent their days walking rough terrain. The prints came in multiple sizes, multiple depths, multiple directions. The soil was dark and damp. The edges were still sharp, not yet softened by wind or gravity. Ellery touched the dirt inside the nearest print. Cool, slightly tacky. Her mind processed the information, automatically matching moisture content against temperature and humidity, calculating time elapsed since the foot had pressed into the soil. Minutes, not hours, minutes. These people had walked through here within the last 30 minutes, maybe less, maybe much less. She looked up from the tracks and scanned the forest ahead. The pine stand continued for another 50 meters before giving way to denser old growth. Beyond that, the terrain dropped into a wide valley that her map showed as a series of gentle benches, the kind of terrain where people would naturally gather because the ground was flat and the water was close. The intelligence reports had placed the sovereign wolves 4 kilometers east of Camp Fielding. These tracks were only 2.5 kilometers out. The wolves were not where they were supposed to be. They were here, they were close. They were close enough that somewhere beyond those trees, somewhere down in that valley, hundreds of armed men were gathering. This was the moment. This was the hinge point around which everything that followed would swing. Every decision Ellery made in the next 60 seconds would determine whether 6 people lived or died, whether an attack on Ridgecrest was prevented or carried out, whether this mission ended in triumph, or in a footnote about a patrol that walked into the forest and never walked out. She could radio Camp Fielding, request helicopter, gunships, air support, a reaction force. That would bring help, but it would also bring noise, and noise would scatter the wolves into the timber where they could never be found. She could set an ambush right here on the trail and engage the next group that walked past. 6 rifles from concealment could kill 20 or 30 men before the rest reacted. That would be a victory by most measures. That would be something to write in a report. But 20 or 30 was not 600. And if they opened fire, the remaining 570 would vanish into the forest. The intelligence would be lost. The target would disappear. And 6 people against 570 in a running firefight through old-growth timber was not a fight. It was a funeral. Ellery made her decision in the time it took to breathe in and breathe out. She looked at Nolan and made two hand signals. Follow. Track. Behind her, Shepard Vane saw the signal and felt something cold flood through his chest. Follow the tracks meant moving toward the enemy, not away. It meant getting closer to 600 armed men, not calling for help. It meant trusting that 6 people could stay invisible long enough to find the heart of the enemy position and survive long enough to do something about it. He wanted to signal a protest. He wanted to suggest no, to insist that they call for extraction, that they report what they had found, and let Kessler's helicopters handle the rest. That was the safe choice. That was the rational choice. That was the choice that did not involve 6 people walking deliberately into the shadow of an army. But Ellery was already moving, slowly, silently following the footprints deeper into the forest, her rifle up her eyes, scanning her body, moving through the undergrowth like something that had grown there. And Nolan was moving with her, and Beckett was moving, and Cormac was moving, and the formation was flowing forward like water finding its way downhill, silent and inevitable. Shepard stood alone for perhaps 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which the forest was utterly still around him, and the only sound was his own pulse and the distant, barely audible conversation of men who did not know they were being hunted. Then he followed. Back at Camp Fielding, Marcus Driscoll sat in the communications tent monitoring the radio net. He heard Beckett's whispered transmission come through barely audible, compressed into the fewest possible words. Grid coordinates, direction of movement, estimated enemy strength based on track density, and 2 words that made Marcus sit up straighter in his chair despite his aching knee. Following tracks. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He had taught Ellery the doctrine of pursuit. He had explained to her over and over in training exercises, in classroom sessions, in late-night conversations over bad coffee, that the greatest tactical advantage in forest warfare was not firepower or numbers or technology. It was position. If you knew exactly where the enemy was, and the enemy did not know you existed, then you owned the battlefield before the first shot was fired. Ellery was doing what he had trained her to do. She was following the scent to the source. She was going to find 600 men and mark their position for the artillery, and she was going to do it with nothing but her eyes and her patience and the skills of the 5 people behind her. He opened his eyes and looked at the map on the table in front of him. He marked Ellery's position with a small pencil dot. Then he picked up the phone and called the artillery battery commander, Major Andrea Walsh. He told Walsh to keep her guns ready. He told her that sometime in the next 24 hours, she might receive a fire mission, unlike anything she had handled before. He told her to trust whatever coordinates came through on the scout frequency, because the person calling them in was the best forward observer he had ever trained. Walsh asked him how he could be sure. "Because I taught her everything I know," Marcus said, "and she learned things I never could." He hung up the phone and looked at the map again. The small pencil dot marking Ellery's position was already obsolete. She was moving deeper into the forest, deeper into the shadow, closer to 600 men who did not know that death was walking toward them on silent feet. Marcus picked up his cold coffee. He did not drink it. He just held it in both hands and waited. The footprints led northeast deeper into the valley, and Ellery followed them the way a river follows gravity. Without hesitation, without hurry. The afternoon light was failing. The sun had dropped behind the western ridge, and the forest floor was darkening by degrees, the gold fading to amber, fading to gray, fading to something that was not quite night, but was no longer day. In the canopy above, the last light still touched the treetops, turning them copper and rose, but down here, down where 6 people moved through the undergrowth in single file, the world was becoming a place of shapes and suggestions. Trees became columns of shadow. Bushes became dark masses that could be anything. The trail ahead narrowed to a thread of disturbed earth winding between the trunks, and Nolan followed it with his eyes down and his senses turned up to a frequency that most people never access in their entire lives. They had been moving for 2 hours since discovering the tracks. In those 2 hours, they had covered perhaps 300 meters. A child could throw a ball that far. A person could walk it in 4 minutes on a sidewalk. But this was not a sidewalk, and speed was not the currency that mattered here. Information was the currency. Silence was the currency. Every meter gained without being detected was worth more than a kilometer covered at a run. Ellery moved behind Nolan, matching his pace, exactly placing her feet where his feet had been. Her rifle held low and close, her breathing controlled through her nose in long, shallow cycles. Behind her, the team followed in the same rhythm, a single organism with 6 heartbeats threading itself through the forest like a needle through cloth. Every 30 minutes, Beckett Lyle unslung the radio handset from its cradle against his chest and pressed it to his lips. His transmissions were whispers so quiet that anyone more than 2 feet away would have heard nothing at all. Just grid coordinates, direction of travel, estimated time to the next waypoint. The words took less than 5 seconds. Then the handset went back and the silence returned. Back at Camp Fielding in the communications tent, a radio operator named Corporal Hess marked each transmission on the map with a pencil dot and a timestamp. The dots formed a line that crept northeast at a pace so slow it seemed like the pencil was barely moving. Hess had been tracking patrols for 3 years, and he had never seen one move this slowly. He mentioned it to Marcus Driscoll, who was sitting in the same folding chair he had occupied for the past 6 hours, his bad knee propped on an ammunition crate. Marcus looked at the map and the line of dots and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Good. That is exactly right." Hess did not understand. Marcus did not explain. In the forest, the darkness settled in like water, filling a basin rising from the ground up. Ellery could no longer see the footprints on the trail. The details that had been legible in daylight, the depth of the impression, the moisture in the soil, the direction of the toe, all of it was gone, swallowed by the dark. But Nolan did not stop. He navigated now by other senses. The feel of the ground under his boots softer, where many feet had packed the trail harder, where untouched forest floor still held the structure of roots and rock. The smell of the air, which carried faint traces of smoke and human habitation from somewhere ahead, growing stronger by imperceptible degrees as they moved closer to whatever lay at the end of these tracks. The forest at night was alive in ways that the daytime forest concealed. Owls called from invisible perches, their voices dropping through the canopy like stones into water. Small animals moved through the undergrowth, their passage marked by rustling that started and stopped, with the unpredictability of things that lived by instinct rather than plan. Somewhere to the south, a coyote began to howl and was answered by another, and then another, until the sound surrounded them on 3 sides, and Shepard Vane felt the hair rise on the back of his neck, before the howling faded and the silence returned. Every sound had to be classified. Every sound had to be assigned to a category, natural or human, threat or ambient. The mind did this automatically after enough training, sorting inputs the way a post office sorts mail, but it was exhausting work, and the exhaustion was cumulative. By midnight, Ellery could feel the fatigue pressing against her awareness, like a hand pressing against a window, not breaking through yet, but applying constant pressure. She did not stop. Stopping was not an option. The tracks were fresh, and the enemy was close, and every hour that passed was an hour closer to whatever the Sovereign Wolves were planning. If their intelligence was right, the attack on Ridgecrest could come within 24 hours. If the team stopped to rest, they might wake up to the sound of gunfire 12 miles to the west as 600 armed men hit a town of 300 civilians. So they moved. Hour after hour through the deep hours of the night, when the body wants nothing except to lie down and close its eyes, they moved. 1 foot in front of the other. Stop. Listen. Count to 60. Move again. 50 meters. Stop. Listen. Count to 60. Move again. At 2300 hours, they crossed a small creek that did not appear on the map. The water was no more than ankle deep, running over smooth stones that clicked faintly underfoot, no matter how carefully they stepped. Ellery spent 4 minutes studying the creek bed before choosing a crossing point where the stones were largest and most stable, where a misplaced foot was least likely to slip and send a splash echoing through the silent forest. They crossed one at a time, each person waiting until the one ahead had reached the far bank before stepping into the water. The creek took them 12 minutes to cross, 12 minutes for 15 feet of water. At midnight, the temperature dropped. The sweat that had soaked their uniforms all day turned cold against their skin, and Ellery felt the first shiver run through her shoulders. She clenched her jaw to stop her teeth from chattering, because even that small sound, the involuntary percussion of enamel on enamel, could carry in the stillness. Behind her, she knew the others were doing the same, fighting in their own bodies in the most basic way possible, trying to be quieter than biology wanted them to be. Nolan stopped 3 times during the night to examine things on the ground that Ellery could not see. Each time he knelt for 2 or 3 minutes, his fingers touching the earth with the delicacy of a blind person reading Braille. And each time he rose and adjusted their direction, slightly following signs that were invisible to everyone but him. A depression in the pine needles where someone had knelt. A patch of bark scraped from a tree trunk at shoulder height, the kind of mark a rifle sling leaves when a man leans against a tree to rest. A cigarette butt barely visible, crushed into the dirt and already half buried by fallen needles, but still carrying the faintest ghost of tobacco smell when Nolan held it beneath his nose. These were the breadcrumbs. These were the signs that an army had passed this way, and recently and in numbers, that confirmed what the intelligence had suggested. Ellery marked each discovery on her map with a tiny pencil dot, building a picture of the enemy's movements the way an archaeologist reconstructs a civilization from pottery shards and broken tools. The technique was maddening in its deliberateness. Shepard felt it most acutely. His body was young and strong and wanted to cover ground, wanted to stride forward and get this over with, wanted to reach the objective or turn back or do anything other than this glacial creep through an endless, dark forest. His training had prepared him for hardship and danger, but it had not fully prepared him for this particular kind of discipline. The discipline of extreme slowness, which is harder than the discipline of extreme effort, because effort at least gives you the satisfaction of feeling like you are doing something. He thought about Kessler's plan, 200 men in helicopters, fast, aggressive, decisive. They would have been there by now. They would have found the enemy or scattered them, and the mission would be over one way or another. Instead, here he was creeping through the dark at the pace of a garden snail, following a woman 10 years older than the plan he had been taught to believe in. But then he remembered the sound of the branch. It happened at 0200 hours, 2 in the morning, in a stretch of forest so dark that Shepard could not see his own hands. The team was moving through a dense stand of young Douglas fir, the trees growing so close together that they had to turn sideways to pass between the trunks, and the ground beneath the trees was littered with fallen branches hidden under a layer of dead needles. Shepard's right boot came down on a branch. He felt it the instant before it happened. The slight give of wood under a compression, the millisecond of resistance before the break, and then the sound. A crack, sharp and clean and impossibly loud in the silence. It was not a gunshot. It was not an explosion. It was a stick breaking under a boot. A sound that happens 10,000 times a day in every forest on Earth. But in this forest, at this hour, in this silence, it was a thunderclap. Everyone froze, not by command, by instinct. 6 people became 6 statues in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Shepard stood with his boot still on the broken branch. His weight committed, unable to lift his foot without risking another sound. His heart was hammering so hard, he was certain it was audible. Sweat ran into his eyes and he could not blink it away because blinking meant moving and moving was not permitted. Ahead of them, perhaps 60 meters through the trees, a light appeared. A flashlight beam, sweeping left to right, probing the forest in the direction of the sound. A sentry. One of Hargrove's men posted on the perimeter of whatever encampment lay ahead, doing his job, investigating a noise that did not belong to the night. The beam swept closer. It touched the trunk of a tree 5 meters to Shepard's left. It illuminated a patch of ground 10 meters ahead, turning the pine needles bright gold against the surrounding darkness. Moths appeared in the light like tiny ghosts spiraling toward the beam, with the mindless devotion of things that cannot resist what will destroy them. Shepard did not breathe. He locked his diaphragm and held the air in his lungs and felt his vision start to narrow at the edges, the way it does when oxygen runs low. Beside him, he could sense, rather than see, Cormac Whitaker equally still, equally frozen, a man-shaped absence in the dark. The flashlight beam moved again, closer. It crossed the ground where Nolan was kneeling, missing him by perhaps 2 meters, and Shepard saw in that brief illumination that Nolan had his face pressed into the crook of his elbow, hiding the pale skin that might catch and reflect the light. Smart, practiced, the kind of thing you only knew to do if you had done it before. The beam held steady for a long moment, pointing directly at the gap between 2 trees where Ellery was standing. If the sentry walked forward 10 more steps, if he angled the light down instead of ahead, he would see her. He would see a woman in camouflage standing perfectly still, with a rifle held against her chest, and then he would shout, and then the night would come apart. 8 minutes. For 8 minutes, the sentry stood in the darkness and probed the forest with his light. 8 minutes in which 6 people did not move, did not breathe, normally did not shift their weight, or scratch an itch or swallow. 8 minutes in which the entire mission balanced on the behavior of a single man with a flashlight who was trying to decide whether the sound he heard was worth investigating further. Then the light went out. Footsteps moved away back toward the perimeter, back toward the voices in the faint glow that marked the edge of the encampment. The sentry had decided it was nothing. A deer, a falling branch, the forest being the forest. Silence returned. Ellery waited a full 5 minutes after the light disappeared before she allowed herself to breathe normally. Then she turned and looked at Shepard. She could not see his face in the dark, but she could feel his fear and his shame radiating off him like heat from a stove. He had made a mistake that could have killed all 6 of them. In another unit with another commander, that mistake might have earned a whispered reprimand, a demotion, a mark on a record that would follow him for years. Ellery did not reprimand him. She did not whisper a single word of criticism. She simply looked in his direction for a longer moment, at a look he could feel even if he could not see, and then she nodded once and turned back to the trail and began moving again. That was all. A look and a nod, but something changed in Shepard Vane in that moment. The impatience that had been burning in him since the first day, the doubt about the method, the frustration with the pace, the half-formed conviction that this was the wrong way to do things, all of it went quiet. Not gone, just quiet, replaced by something he had not felt before, an understanding that had to be earned through experience because no classroom could teach it. The slowness was the point. The patience was the weapon. The silence was not absence. It was presence of the most intense kind, a presence so focused and so disciplined that it could make 6 people invisible in a forest full of enemies. Shepard placed his next step with a care he had never exercised before, and the step after that, and every step for the rest of the night. While 6 people crept through the dark forest, 2 parallel dramas were unfolding at Camp Fielding. In the operations center, Colonel Kessler stood over the map table and watched the clock with the impatience of a man who measured competence and speed. Ellery's patrol had been in the field for 13 days. 13 days of slow movement and whispered radio calls and pencil dots on a map that seemed to crawl across the paper like a wounded insect. In that time, Kessler's helicopter assault force had been sitting idle pilots playing cards, crew chiefs cleaning weapons that did not need cleaning, 200 soldiers eating rations and waiting for an order that never came. He had given Marcus Driscoll's request 48 hours. That was 12 days ago. The 48 hours had stretched to a week, then 10 days, then 12, because each time Kessler moved to launch his assault, Marcus produced some new piece of information from the patrol, a footprint, a direction of travel, a faint radio intercept, just enough to justify another day of waiting. But Kessler's patience was a shallow pool and it had run dry. He had drafted the order for the helicopter assault, launch at 700 the morning of day 14, 12 helicopters, 200 soldiers. The full weight of the National Guard response dropped into the Pine Ridge like a hammer onto an anvil. If the sovereign wolves heard the helicopters coming, which they would, Because 12 helicopters make a sound you can hear from 5 miles away, then they would scatter. They would break into small groups and disappear into the 70,000 acres of wilderness that they knew better than any outsider. The intelligence would be lost. The concentration of force that represented the single greatest opportunity to end this crisis would dissolve like salt in water. And 6 people in the forest would suddenly be surrounded by small, angry, well-armed groups of men who would be looking for someone to blame for the noise in the sky. Marcus knew all of this. He sat in the communications tent with the latest transmission from Beckett-Lyle in front of him, the grid coordinates showing the patrol's position now less than 500 meters from where the track density suggested the main enemy concentration would be. 500 meters, close. So close that by dawn the patrol might be in position to call fire. But dawn was also when Kessler's helicopters were scheduled to launch. And if those helicopters launched, everything Ellery had done in 13 days of silent movement would be erased in the time it took for rotor blades to reach operating speed. Marcus looked at the clock. 300. 4 hours until Kessler's launch order went into effect. 4 hours to get Ellery into position and get the artillery firing before 12 helicopters turned the entire operation into a disaster. He picked up the phone and called Major Andrea Walsh. Walsh commanded the artillery battery at Camp Fielding. 4 105mm howitzers, each capable of throwing a 33-pound high-explosive shell more than 10 kilometers. Her crews were experienced and fast. They could put a round in the air every 15 seconds per gun, which meant that at full rate of fire, a shell was landing on target every 4 seconds. That was the kind of mathematics that could reshape a landscape. Marcus told Walsh what he knew. The patrol was close, possibly within hours of fixing the target. He needed the guns-ready crews on standby, ammunition prepared. And he needed Walsh to be ready to fire on coordinates from the scout frequency without waiting for approval from Kessler's operations center. Walsh was quiet for a moment. What Marcus was asking her to do was not quite insubordination, but it lived in the same neighborhood. Fire missions were supposed to go through the operations center. Kessler was supposed to approve them. Bypassing that chain meant putting her career on the line based on the word of a retired sergeant with a bad knee and a 29-year-old patrol commander in the woods. She thought about it for 10 seconds. 10 seconds that felt much longer. Then she asked Marcus one question. Is your girl going to find them? Marcus did not hesitate. She already has. She just does not know the exact address yet. Walsh told him her guns would be ready. She told him she understood the risk and she accepted it. Then she said something that Marcus would remember long after the rest of the conversation had faded. She said some orders are worth following even when nobody gives them. In the forest, the darkness was beginning to change. Not lighter yet, not dawn, but the quality of the blackness was shifting, losing its absolute density, becoming something that was less like a wall and more like a curtain. The stars had faded, the eastern horizon invisible behind the trees, but perceptible as a faint lessening of the dark, was announcing the approach of morning. Ellery could smell the enemy camp. Not strongly, not the way you smell a restaurant when you walk past the door, but there underneath the pine and the earth, in the cold night air, a thread of smoke. Cooking fires that had burned down to coals but were still releasing their signature into the atmosphere. And underneath the smoke, the smell of humanity. Sweat and food and waste, and the metallic tang of gun oil. The smell of many people living close together in a small space. She estimated they were within 200 meters of the main concentration. The track density had increased dramatically in the last hour. The game trail had become a path, and the path had become almost a road packed down by hundreds of feet over days or weeks. On either side, she could see where the undergrowth had been trampled. Branches broken at waist height, small trees bent aside. An army had moved through here, and it had moved with the confidence of an army that believed it owned this territory. At 5:30, the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy. Shapes began to resolve. Trees separated from shadows. The ground became visible, a carpet of brown needles and dark earth, and the crisscrossing impressions of footprints too numerous to count. And then Ellery saw them. Through a gap in the undergrowth, looking downslope into a wide natural clearing, in the old timber, she saw movement. The shapes of men, dozens of them at first visible as darker forms against the gray dawn light, sitting and standing and moving between positions. Then, as the light grew more of them, scores. And then as the clearing revealed its full extent, stretching 400 meters across and perhaps 300 meters deep, she saw the truth. 600 men. They filled the clearing the way a market fills a town square, dense and chaotic and alive with the low hum of collective activity. Cooking fires sent thin columns of smoke into the still morning air. Men sat in groups eating, talking, cleaning weapons. Tarps had been strung between trees to create sheltered areas where equipment was stacked in organized piles. And what equipment it was. Ellery felt her stomach tighten as she cataloged what she could see. Mortar tubes, at least 4, set up in prepared positions with ammunition boxes stacked beside them. What appeared to be recoilless rifles mounted on improvised tripods pointed west toward Ridgecrest. Crates of rifle ammunition stacked 3 and 4 high enough to supply a sustained assault for days. RPG launchers leaning against tree trunks like fishing rods outside a cabin door. This was not a militia encampment. This was a staging area for a major offensive. These people were not hiding in the forest. They were preparing to come out of it with enough firepower to overwhelm anything that stood between them and the town of Ridgecrest. And they had made one enormous mistake. They had stacked everything together. Ammunition, weapons, fuel supplies, all concentrated in one area because concentration felt safe. 600 men felt strong. 600 men felt unbeatable. Who would attack 600 armed fighters in their own territory, in a forest they controlled, surrounded by sentries and fortified positions? The sovereign wolves had reason for their confidence. They had been operating in the Pine Ridge for 6 months without a single serious challenge. Federal law enforcement had attempted 2 operations against them in that time. The first was a negotiation team that drove up a logging road in 3 SUVs and was turned back at a roadblock by 40 armed men who made it clear that the conversation was over before it began. The second was a surveillance drone that the wolves shot down with a hunting rifle on its 3rd pass over their territory, a fight of marksmanship that became a recruiting tool when the video appeared on encrypted channels. They had beaten the system twice, and the system had not come back. That pattern breeds a particular kind of arrogance, the arrogance of people who mistake the government's caution for weakness. Hargrove encouraged it. In his evening addresses to the assembled fighters, which the patrol could not hear, but which captured members would later describe in detail, he spoke about the inevitable collapse of federal authority, about the new order that would rise from the mountains, about the historical inevitability of men who were willing to fight defeating institutions that were afraid to. His men believed him. They believed him because belief is easier than doubt, and because the evidence of their own experience supported his claims. They had defied the federal government, and the federal government had blinked. They had 600 men and enough weapons to arm twice that number. They had the forest, and they had each other, and they had the certainty that comes from living inside an echo chamber where every voice confirms what you already want to believe. That certainty was their real weakness, not the stacked ammunition, not the cooking fires that made smoke, not the sentries who watched the sky instead of the ground. Those were symptoms. The disease was the belief that because they could not see a threat, no threat existed. But the sentries were watching for helicopters. They were watching for large formations of soldiers moving through the timber. They were watching for the kind of threat that announced itself with noise and movement in the visible signature of a conventional military operation. They were not watching for 6 people lying motionless in the undergrowth 150 meters away, so still that a bird had landed on a branch 3 feet above Cormac Whitaker's head and had not noticed him. Ellery looked at her map. She measured the distance from her position to the center of the enemy concentration. She measured the distance from the enemy concentration to Camp Fielding's artillery battery, 2.8 kilometers, well within the effective range of the 105 millimeter howitzers. She looked at her watch, 6:15. Less than 45 minutes until Kessler's helicopters were scheduled to launch. 45 minutes to call, fire, execute the mission, and render those helicopters unnecessary. 45 minutes before the noise in the sky scattered 600 men into the wilderness forever. She looked at Beckett. He already had the radio handset in his hand, held close to his chest, waiting for the word. Ellery whispered to him. 3 sentences. Grid coordinates. Target description. 600 enemy fighters in the open with heavy weapons and ammunition stores. Beckett pressed the handset to his lips and began to whisper. At Camp Fielding, the transmission came through the speaker in the communications tent like a voice from another world, thin and ghostly and barely audible above the hiss of static. Corporal Hess leaned forward and pressed his headset against his ears and copied the message word by word. Marcus Driscoll read the message and reached for the phone. He dialed Major Walsh's battery. The phone rang once. Walsh picked up. Marcus read her the coordinates and the target description. Walsh repeated them back. Then she asked the question that every artillery commander asks before committing to a fire mission. The question that separates an artillery strike from an accident. Are you certain of these coordinates? Marcus thought of Ellery lying in the dirt 150 meters from 600 armed men. He thought of the 13 days she had spent getting there. He thought of the broken branch and the flashlight and the 8 minutes of frozen silence. He thought of every hour he had spent training her, every lesson about patience and precision and the discipline of seeing before being seen. Certain, he said. Walsh hung up and walked out of her command post into the pre-dawn gray. Her 4 howitzers stood in a line on a flat piece of ground at the eastern edge of Camp Fielding, their barrels angled upward like fingers pointing at the sky. 24 crew members stood at their positions waiting. They had been waiting all night. She gave the order, load and prepare for fire mission. Priority target. The crews began to move. Shells came out of their storage crates and were passed hand to hand to the loaders. Propellant charges were measured and attached. Elevation and azimuth were calculated from the coordinates and dialed into the gun sights with the precision of a watchmaker setting a spring. At 0645, everything was ready. 4 guns, 4 crews, 4 shells and 4 breaches, each one containing enough high explosive to turn a 30-meter circle of forest into a crater. At that same moment in the operations center, 200 meters away, Colonel Kessler was finalizing the helicopter assault order. His aide had the flight manifest printed. The pilots had been briefed at 00:5:30. The rotors on the lead helicopter were scheduled to begin spinning at 00:6:55, with all 12 aircraft airborne by 07:10. Kessler stood at the map table in his press uniform, a man about to get exactly what he wanted. He did not know that 4 artillery pieces were loaded and aimed, and that a 29-year-old woman in the woods had already found the target he was about to spend 12 helicopters looking for. He would learn. In about 2 minutes he would learn. Walsh picked up her radio. She called the scout frequency. Beckett answered on the first transmission. Walsh said 2 words, standing by. 150 meters from 600 men who were eating breakfast and checking weapons and laughing about things that did not matter anymore. Ellery Garrett heard those 2 words come through the handset pressed to Beckett's ear. She could see the glow of cooking fires. She could hear the sound of voices relaxed and ordinary, the sound of people who believed they were safe. She was about to prove them wrong. She looked at her team, 5 faces looking back at her in the gray light, 5 people who had followed her for 14 days through the most difficult terrain on the continent, who had trusted her judgment when that judgment said to move slower, to go deeper, to get closer. 5 people who understood, now all of them, even Shepard, what patience could achieve when it was applied with absolute discipline. She took the handset from Beckett. She held it close to her lips, and in a whisper that carried no further than the ears of the man beside her, and the radio waves that would travel 2.8 kilometers to a battery of guns pointed at the sky, she spoke. Fire mission. Grid to follow. Priority target. 600 enemy in the open. Request fire for effect. Then she put the handset down and pressed her face into the earth and waited for the sky to fall. The first sound was not an explosion. It was a whisper. The whisper of a shell leaving a barrel 2.8 kilometers away, a sound so distant and so faint that only someone who knew what to listen for would recognize it. A soft thump felt more than heard carried through the morning air, like the first note of a symphony that no one in the clearing below had purchased tickets to attend. Ellery heard it. She pressed herself flatter against the earth, turning her face sideways so that one cheek rested on the pine needles and one eye could still see through the gap in the undergrowth toward the enemy position. Beside her, 5 men did the same. They made themselves as small as possible, as close to the ground as human bodies could get, because what was coming next did not distinguish between friend and enemy. It only understood distance. The ranging shot arrived at 0647. It came down through the canopy with a sound like tearing fabric, a ripping shriek that lasted less than a second before the shell struck the earth 50 meters short of the clearing's center. The explosion was sharp and percussive, a crack that punched through the morning stillness and sent a column of dirt and smoke spiraling upward through the trees. Birds erupted from the canopy in every direction, hundreds of them, a dark cloud of wings and panic that rose above the treetops and wheeled in confused circles against the pale sky. In the clearing, 600 men looked up. For a moment, perhaps 2 seconds, there was no reaction other than surprise. Heads turned toward the column of smoke. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A man holding a cup of coffee stood motionless with a cup halfway to his lips, staring at the place where a tree had stood 1 second ago and a crater existed now. The human mind needs time to process the unexpected, to match what it is seeing against its library of experience, and find the appropriate response. For most of the men in that clearing, the library contained no entry for artillery fire from a clear sky at breakfast time. Then understanding arrived, and with understanding came fear. Ellery was already on the radio. Her voice was a whisper, but the words were precise, delivered with a clinical clarity that stripped away everything except information. Add 50, fire for effect. Those 3 words meant stop testing and start destroying. Those 3 words meant everything. At camp fielding, Major Andrea Walsh received the correction and relayed it to her gun crews in a voice that was loud enough to carry across the battery position and steady enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. Add 50, fire for effect, all guns. 24 crew members moved in unison. Breeches opened. Spent casings ejected with a metallic clang. Fresh shells slid home. Propellant charges seated. Breeches closed. Elevation adjusted by the smallest increment, 50 meters of additional range translated into a fraction of a degree of barrel angle. The mathematics of destruction reduced to the turn of a dial. At 6:49, Walsh spoke into her radio, shot out. 4 shells left. 4 barrels in a sequence so rapid it sounded like a single prolonged explosion. A rolling boom that echoed off the mountain walls and sent vibrations through the ground that could be felt in the mess tent a quarter mile away. Soldiers who had been eating breakfast stopped chewing. Helicopter pilots looked up from their card games. Kessler in his operations center, reviewing the assault plan he intended to launch in 11 minutes, paused and turned toward the sound. At 0650, the clearing erupted. 4 high explosive shells landed within a 2-second window across an area roughly the size of a basketball court in the center of the Sovereign Wolves concentration. The effect was not 4 separate explosions. It was a single event, a simultaneous hammering of the earth that compressed the air into a wall of pressure and released it outward at the speed of sound. The pressure wave hit Ellery's position 200 meters away with enough force to press her body into the ground and pop her ears and fill her mouth with the taste of metal and dust. Trees that had stood for 100 years disintegrated, not fell, not broke, disintegrated. The trunks became clouds of splinters that flew outward in every direction, each splinter a projectile, each piece of bark a fragment, traveling fast enough to pierce skin and muscle and bone. The ground rose in columns of brown and black dirt and rock and debris hurled skyward and suspended for a moment in a grotesque imitation of a fountain before gravity reclaimed it and sent it raining back down on everything below. And then the guns fired again. This was what fire for effect meant. Not a single volley. All state boss on a pause to assess damage. Continuous fire round after round, shell after shell. each gun crew working at maximum rate, loading and firing every 15 seconds with a mechanical rhythm that transformed individual actions into a continuous flow of destruction. 4 guns firing in rotation meant a shell arriving on target every 4 seconds. Every 4 seconds, another 33 pounds of high explosive and steel casing detonated in the clearing, where 600 men were trying to understand what was happening to them. Ellery kept her eye on the gap in the undergrowth. She watched the clearing through the smoke and debris with the detached focus of a surgeon watching a monitor during an operation. Her job was not over. Her job was only beginning. Because artillery without observation is just noise. Artillery with a trained observer directing each adjustment, walking the fire across the target like a painter drawing a brush across canvas. That was the difference between a barrage and an annihilation. She saw groups of men running north toward a tree line that might offer cover. She keyed the radio, north 200. Beckett repeated it. 30 seconds later, shells began landing in the tree line to the north. She saw another group scrambling south toward a ravine. South 150, shells walked south. Every direction they ran, the fire followed, guided by a woman lying in the dirt with a radio and a pair of eyes that did not blink. The sovereign wolves tried to respond. Some of them tried to return fire, shooting their rifles into the forest in random directions, aiming at nothing because there was nothing to aim at. The artillery was coming from nearly 3 kilometers away, invisible and unreachable. Others tried to reach the mortar positions, thinking they could fire back, but the mortar positions had been in the center of the clearing, and the center of the clearing no longer existed as a recognizable place. Then the secondary explosions began. The ammunition stores, those neat stacks of crates that had represented months of smuggling and accumulation, began to detonate. The first explosion was a single crate of rifle ammunition ignited by a shell fragment that punched through the wooden side and struck a cartridge primer. The crate erupted in a sustained crackle of individual rounds, cooking off bullets, flying in every direction without aim or purpose. A lethal hailstorm that lasted 30 seconds and cut down men who had survived the initial barrage. Then a second crate went, then a third, then an entire pallet of mortar rounds detonated in a single massive blast that was larger than any of the artillery shells. A deep, thundering boom that Ellery felt in her chest cavity, and that sent a mushroom of black smoke boiling up above the canopy. The shock wave flattened trees in a 50-meter radius around the detonation point, laying them down in neat radial lines like matchsticks arranged by a careful hand. RPG warheads cooked off in their crates, each one a sharp crack, followed by a jet of fire and smoke. Propellant charges for the recoilless rifles ignited and burned with a white intensity that was visible even through the smoke. Small arms ammunition caught fire in quantities that produced not individual shots, but a continuous roar, thousands of rounds detonating in a cascade that sounded like the world's largest sheet of bubble wrap being crushed by the world's largest fist. From 0651 to 0704:13 minutes, the timber plantation became a place that the men who survived it would later describe with a single word: hell. Ellery called corrections 7 times during those 13 minutes. Each correction shifted the fire to a new concentration of fleeing men, a new pocket of resistance, a new area where the smoke cleared enough for her to see movement. She operated with a precision that was almost mechanical, her voice never rising above a whisper, her observations delivered in the terse grammar of fire direction that eliminated every unnecessary word. White phosphorus marker rounds burst among the trees, igniting spot fires that sent columns of acrid white smoke drifting across the clearing. The smoke served a dual purpose. It marked impact points for the gun crews, and it obscured the vision of anyone trying to organize a coherent response. The phosphorus itself burned at temperatures that could not be extinguished by water-producing wounds that were as terrible as they were effective. Tree bursts were the worst, shells that detonated when they struck the canopy rather than the ground, sending their shrapnel downward in a cone of metal fragments that reached the forest floor like steel rain. There was no protection from tree bursts. A foxhole would not save you. A bunker would not save you. The only defense was not being there, And for 600 men packed into a 400-meter clearing, not being there was not an option. At her position, Ellery felt each impact as a physical sensation, a compression of air followed by a release, a rhythmic pulsing that resonated in her bones and made her teeth ache. Debris fell around her position constantly, pine needles and bark fragments and pieces of wood spinning down from the canopy like confetti at a parade that celebrated nothing worth celebrating. The air smelled of cordite and phosphorus and burnt pine sap, a chemical cocktail that stung her eyes and coated the back of her throat. She did not close her eyes. She did not stop watching. She did not stop calling corrections. Because this was what the 14 days had been for. This was what the patience and the silence and the discipline had purchased. Not the right to kill, but the knowledge of exactly where to direct the killing so that it would be thorough and it would be final and it would prevent the larger killing that 600 armed men had been planning to inflict on a town of 300 civilians 12 miles to the west. At 07:04, Ellery keyed the radio one final time. Ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. The guns fell silent. The last shell had already left its barrel, already arcing through the morning sky, and it landed 3 seconds after the ceasefire call with a final crump that echoed off the ridgeline and faded into the distance like the last note of a requiem. Then silence. Not ordinary silence. Not the silence of a quiet morning or an empty room. This was the silence that follows violence so extreme that it strips the world of its ability to make sound. The birds were gone. The insects were gone. The wind itself seemed to have stopped, as if the atmosphere needed a moment to recover from what had been pushed through it. Smoke rose from the clearing in a column so thick and so dark that it was visible from Camp Fielding, visible from the highway 20 miles south, visible from anywhere within a 100-mile radius, where a person happened to look east and see a pillar of gray and black climbing into the morning sky like a signal fire built by giants. Small fires burned throughout the clearing, feeding on splintered wood and scattered supplies and things that Ellery chose not to identify. The trees that were still standing, and there were not many, had been stripped of their branches and bark. They stood like white bones pointing at the sky, skeletal and bare monuments to what had stood there 15 minutes ago and would never stand there again. Ellery did not move forward. That was the decision that saved her team's life a second time. The instinct, the powerful magnetic pull of wanting to see the result, to walk into the clearing and confirm the damage and count the dead, that instinct was wrong. And she knew it was wrong because Marcus had told her it was wrong 100 times during training. After a strike, the survivors are disoriented, terrified, wounded, and armed. They cannot process what has happened to them. They do not know who attacked them or from where. They are in a state of psychological shock that makes them unpredictable and therefore more dangerous than they were before the first shell landed. Walking into that clearing would be walking into a space filled with wounded, panicking, heavily armed men who would shoot at anything that moved. So Ellery did what she had been trained to do. She signaled withdrawal. The team began to pull back from their observation position, moving south away from the clearing, retracing their route through the undergrowth with the same agonizing slowness they had used to approach. Cormac Whitaker moved last, and as he withdrew, he set claymore mines at 2 points along their back trail. Each mine was positioned facing north toward the clearing, its curved face packed with 700 steel ball bearings that would be propelled outward in a 60-degree arc at 1,200 meters per second if the firing device was triggered. Insurance. The kind of insurance you hoped you would never need to collect on. They had covered perhaps 80 meters when Nolan raised his fist. Freeze. Ellery heard them before she saw them. Footsteps. Not stealthy footsteps. The stumbling, crashing, desperate footsteps of people running through a forest without caring about noise or concealment. Branches breaking. Heavy breathing. The unmistakable sound of men fleeing something terrible. Through the trees to the north movement. Shapes emerging from the smoke, materializing like ghosts from the gray haze that still hung over the forest floor. Men in civilian clothes and camouflage, some carrying rifles, some carrying nothing, some limping, some running, all moving south with the single-minded urgency of people who wanted only to be somewhere else. 40 of them, maybe more. A group of survivors from the northern edge of the clearing, men who had been far enough from the center of the barrage to escape the worst of it, now pushing through the forest in a ragged column that was heading directly toward Ellery's team. They did not know the team was there. They were not searching, they were not hunting. They were running. But the geometry of the forest had aligned their escape route with the team's withdrawal route, and the two groups were converging on the same patch of ground at the same time. 6 people, 40 people. In the open, in a straight fight, those numbers were survivable but ugly. In a forest at close range, with visibility measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, those numbers were fatal. 40 rifles firing in every direction would cut through 6 people the way a saw cuts through pine. Ellery made the calculation in less than a second. She signaled the team down flat into the ground behind whatever cover existed. A log, a depression, a thick patch of fern, anything that broke the outline of a human body against the forest floor. She pressed herself into a shallow dip in the earth behind a rotting stump that smelled of mushrooms and decay, and she held her rifle against her chest, and she did not breathe. The group passed within 30 meters of her position. She could see their faces. Young men, most of them, some bleeding. One man held his arm against his chest at an angle that meant it was broken. Another had blood running from both ears, the signature of blast concussion. They moved in a loose cluster, not a formation, stumbling over roots and rocks, their eyes wide with the particular emptiness that comes from having witnessed something the mind is not equipped to process. They passed. They kept moving south, crashing through the undergrowth, their sounds fading gradually as distance absorbed them. They did not look down. They did not check the ground. They did not notice 6 people lying in the earth beneath them, like stones beneath a river. When the sound of their passage had faded completely, Ellery waited another 5 minutes. Then she stood up. She looked at her team. 5 faces looked back. Pale, dirt-streaked, exhausted, alive. She jerked her head south. Move. They moved. Through the forest along a route Ellery had memorized from the map, toward a clearing 2 kilometers south where a helicopter could land. Beckett called in the extraction request as they walked. The helicopter was in the air within 10 minutes. At 7:40, the helicopter touched down in a meadow of wild grass and fireweed. The rotor wash flattened the grass in expanding circles and sent seed heads spiraling into the morning air like tiny white parachutes. The crew chief stood in the open door, one hand on the mounted gun, scanning the tree line with the focused intensity of someone who had heard the artillery and the secondary explosions and knew that whatever was happening in this forest was bigger than any briefing had prepared him for. Nolan climbed aboard first, then Cormac, then Beckett, with the radio still strapped to his back, then Shepard. Each of them moved with the heavy, deliberate motions of people whose bodies had been running on adrenaline for hours and were only now beginning to acknowledge the dead. They settled into the canvas seats along the helicopter's interior wall and sat in the particular silence of people who have shared something that cannot be explained to anyone who was not there. Ellery was the last one aboard. She stood at the edge of the meadow for a moment, looking north toward the column of smoke that was still rising above the tree line, gray against the blue morning sky. The smoke had widened since the ceasefire, spreading in the upper atmosphere into a flat-bottomed cloud that drifted slowly east on the morning breeze. Below it, the forest looked exactly as it had looked 14 days ago when she had walked into it, green and dense and silent and full of secrets. The difference was that now she knew some of those secrets, and knowing them had changed everything. She thought about the 600 men who had been in that clearing 40 minutes ago. She did not think about them with satisfaction or with guilt. She thought about them with the clinical detachment of someone who had done a job that needed doing and who understood that the key was not something to celebrate or to mourn. It was simply something that was necessary, and it had been done, and now it was over. Then she climbed in, and the helicopter lifted off, and the forest fell away below her, becoming a carpet of green and brown, and the single dark smudge of smoke that marked the place where 600 men had been eating breakfast 40 minutes ago. 6 people had walked into the forest 14 days earlier. 6 people flew out. Not one of them had fired a single round from their personal weapons. The after-action reports took weeks to compile. Intelligence analysts, prisoner interviews, aerial photography, and ground surveys all contributed to a picture that emerged slowly like a photograph developing in a darkroom. 245 confirmed dead, more than 350 wounded, many critically. Out of the 600 fighters who had been in that clearing, fewer than 10% escaped without injury. The Sovereign Wolves weapons stockpile was destroyed completely. Every mortar, every recoilless rifle, every crate of ammunition, either detonated by the artillery or consumed by the fires that followed. The planned assault on Ridgecrest was not delayed. It was erased. The organization that had intended to carry it out no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. Survivors who were captured in the following days described the artillery strike in terms that sounded more like natural disaster than military operation. They said the sky fell. They said the forest attacked them. They said they never saw anyone, never heard anyone, never knew they were being watched until the first shell came through the trees. One captured man interviewed at a detention facility 3 days later said something that found its way into the intelligence summary, and from there into the training manuals, and from there into the institutional memory of every tactical unit that studied the Pine Ridge operation. He said they learned to be afraid of the ones they could not see. The helicopters were loud and you could hide from them. The big patrols crashed through the forest and you could hear them coming from a mile away. But the small ones, the quiet ones, the ones that moved like ghosts and never showed themselves, those were the ones that called the fire down from the sky. Those were the ones you could not escape. The tactical analysis compiled by a team from the Department of Justice 3 months after the operation confirmed what the numbers already suggested. The Pine Ridge strike had achieved a result that no conventional operation in the region had come close to matching. The report noted that the entire engagement from the first ranging shot to the ceasefire call had lasted less time than it takes most people to eat breakfast. It noted that the cost of the operation measured in ammunition expended and personnel deployed was a fraction of what Kessler's helicopter assault would have cost. And it noted in a footnote that would be quoted in military academies for years afterward that the decisive factor was not the artillery itself, but the 14 days of patient reconnaissance that preceded it. Without exact coordinates, without precise knowledge of the enemy's disposition and concentration, the artillery would have been firing blind into 70,000 acres of wilderness. The shells would have landed on empty ground. The Sovereign Wolves would have scattered, and the attack on Ridgecrest would have proceeded as planned. It was the 6 people on the ground who made the difference. It was the eyes, it was the patience, it was the willingness to move 2 kilometers in 14 hours when every instinct screamed to move faster. That was what the artillery could not provide on its own. That was what the helicopters could never replace. Ellery received a commendation. Her team received commendations. The operation was briefed to senior leadership as a model of precision reconnaissance and indirect fire coordination. For a brief window of time, it seemed like the lessons of Pine Ridge might change how things were done. They did not. Colonel Kessler's after-action report described the operation as a success of the Joint Task Force response, emphasizing the role of the National Guard's staging and support infrastructure, which he had commanded. The report dedicated 4 pages to the logistical framework that had maintained Camp Fielding as a forward operating base. It praised the readiness of the helicopter crews who had been prepared to launch at a moment's notice. It commended the artillery battery for its rapid and effective response to the fire mission, noting that the guns had been maintained at peak readiness under Kessler's overall operational command. The 6-person patrol was mentioned in a single paragraph on page 11 of a 23-page document. Ellery's name appeared once misspelled. The methodology, the slow movement, the 14 days of patient reconnaissance, the principle that seeing first was more important than shooting first, was characterized as effective in this specific situation, but not broadly applicable to standard operational doctrine. The report recommended that future operations continue to emphasize rapid deployment and overwhelming force as the primary response model. Marcus read the report in his kitchen, standing at the counter with his reading glasses sliding down his nose, and he felt something that was not quite anger and not quite sadness, but lived somewhere in the space between the two. He had seen this before, not just once, many times. The institutional preference for the dramatic over the effective, for the visible over the invisible, for the plan that looked impressive on paper, over the plan that worked in the dirt. It was the oldest story in the history of organizations. The people who did the work rarely got to write the report. Subsequent operations in the region reverted to Kessler's preferred approach. Helicopter insertions, large formations, speed and mass and noise. The results were predictable. Sovereign wolves' remnants scattered into small groups throughout the wilderness heard the helicopters coming and melted into the timber long before the soldiers reached the ground. Pursuit operations produced sporadic contacts and occasional casualties on both sides, but the kind of decisive result that Ellery's team had achieved in 14 minutes was never replicated. 3 federal officers were wounded in a firefight in September. A helicopter was damaged by ground fire in October. The remnants of the sovereign wolves were never fully eliminated. They simply dispersed, absorbed into the wilderness, becoming the kind of problem that persists because the solution requires a patience that institutions are unable to sustain. Ellery did not protest. She did not write a rebuttal to Kessler's report. She did not go to the press or file a complaint through official channels. She understood something that Marcus had taught her early in her training, a lesson that had nothing to do with forests or tactics or the trajectory of artillery shells. You cannot make people see what they do not want to see. You can only make sure that the knowledge survives. You can only pass it on to the next person who is willing to learn. She returned to the training center in northern Washington. The center was a cluster of low buildings set among second-growth timber at the end of a gravel road that didn't appear on any public map. It rained there more often than it did in the fine, persistent drizzle that turned the forest floor into a sponge and the sky into a ceiling of gray that hung just above the treetops. It was the opposite of Pine Ridge in almost every way, cool where Montana had been hot, wet where Montana had been humid, quiet where Montana had been in those 14 minutes the loudest place on earth. Ellery fit into it the way she fit into all forests, naturally, without effort, without the need to impose herself on the environment. She was assigned a class of 12 new tactical response candidates, men and women in their 20s who had volunteered for the hardest training the unit offered and who arrived on their first day with the eager energy of people who believed that courage and aggression were the same thing. They had been selected from hundreds of applicants. They were fit, motivated, intelligent, and almost entirely wrong about what the next 6 months would require of them. They expected to learn how to shoot faster, move faster, react faster. They expected to learn the skills of aggression, the skills of the hunter who charges after his prey. Ellery was going to teach them the skills of a different kind of hunter, the hunter who waits, the hunter who watches, the hunter who understands that the prey does not need to be chased if you already know where it is going to be. On that first morning, she stood in front of the classroom and looked at their faces. Young, confident, impatient, ready to learn how to fight. She recognized the look. She had worn it herself 3 years ago, sitting in a classroom just like this one, listening to a 60-year-old man with a bad knee tell her things she did not want to hear. She picked up a marker and walked to the whiteboard. She wrote 7 words in capital letters, the same 7 words that Marcus Driscoll had written on a whiteboard 3 years ago when she had been sitting where they were sitting, now young and confident and wrong about what mattered most. The side that sees first has already won. She put down the marker and turned to face the class. 12 faces looked back at her with the polite attentiveness of people who were waiting for the real lesson to begin. They did not yet understand that the real lesson was already on the board, that everything she would teach them over the next 6 months, every technique and tactic and principle, was a variation on those 7 words. This is the only lesson, she said. Everything else is just details. She saw a few of them glance at each other. She saw the subtle shifts of expression that said, "That is it." She recognized it. She had made the same face. Marcus had seen it and had said nothing because he knew that some lessons cannot be taught in a classroom. They can only be learned in the dirt, in the dark, in the silence of a forest, where the only thing between you and 600 armed men is your ability to be still. She would take them into the forest tomorrow. She would begin teaching them to walk slowly, and some of them would learn and some of them would not. And the ones who learned would carry the knowledge forward in the way she was carrying it now, a chain of understanding passed from hand to hand across generations, from Marcus to her, from her to them, from them to whoever came next. That was the only legacy that mattered. Not the commendations, not the after-action reports, not the paragraph on page 11 of Kessler's document. The legacy was the knowledge itself, alive in the minds of people who understood what it meant and who would use it when the time came. 300 miles south in a small house on the edge of the Flathead Valley, where the foothills rose toward the mountains and the ponderosa pines grew thick enough to block the afternoon sun, Marcus Driscoll sat on his front porch in a wooden chair that was older than most of the people he had ever commanded. His left knee ached the way it always ached in the mornings, a deep, persistent throb that was as much a part of him now as his heartbeat. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. He answered. Ellery's voice came through clear and steady, the same voice that had whispered fire missions into a radio handset while 600 men slept 150 meters away. I started with the new class today, she said. How are they? Young, confident. They think speed is a virtue. Marcus smiled. A small smile, barely visible, the kind of smile that lived mostly in the eyes. What did you tell them? I told them the only lesson, the one you taught me. Silence on the line. Not uncomfortable silence. The silence of two people who understood each other well enough that words were optional. Then Marcus spoke. Teach them to be patient, Ellery. Teach them that the forest rewards the ones who listen. Ellery said she would. Marcus hung up the phone. He leaned back in his chair and looked out at the tree line, at the ponderosa pines standing in their silent rows, at the shadows moving between the trunks as the morning breeze stirred the branches. Somewhere in those trees, a bird was singing. A simple song, 3 notes repeated, the kind of sound that most people never noticed, because they were too busy making noise of their own. Marcus noticed. He had always noticed. That was the whole point. He lifted his coffee to his lips and drank. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the coffee was still warm. The forest at Pine Ridge had already begun to heal. New growth was pushing up through the scorched earth where 200 artillery shells had landed in 14 minutes. Grass and wildflowers were reclaiming the craters. Saplings were reaching toward the gaps in the canopy where old trees had been shattered. In a few years, the scars would be invisible. In a decade, the forest would look as if nothing had ever happened there. But in training centers across the country, in windowless classrooms, where the next generation of tactical operators sat in rows and learned the craft of moving unseen through hostile territory, instructors still told the story. The story of a morning in July when 6 people walked into 70,000 acres of wilderness and found an army and destroyed it without firing a single shot. The story of a 29-year-old woman who trusted patience over aggression and silence over speed, and who proved that in any fight, in any terrain, in any century, the side that sees first does not merely have an advantage. The side that sees first has already won.